Hello and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Experts Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on DevSecOps 101. What is it and why is it important? Now, before we get to today's timely content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event that you have any technical issues. A browser refresh will fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant as a thank you for attending. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these Expert Series events are special product-neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors makes it possible for us to bring you this content, so we want to give a special shout-out to our sponsors. Over the next few slides, I'm going to share some messages from our sponsors today, and they'll refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. As always, the handout section also has a few valuable Actual Tech Media links. There's a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including another Expert Series event 2 Fridays from now on ransomware. Now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsors. We are supported by Duo. Duo makes securing your entire organization easier with two-factor authentication, remote access, and access control. The products deploy fast in any environment. Visit the handouts link to sign up for a free trial at signupduo.com. Today's event is also sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a developer-first security company that helps software-driven businesses develop fast and build their cloud-native applications securely. Snyk provides a platform to secure all of the critical components of today's cloud-native application development across your IDEs, repos, containers, and pipelines. Learn more at the link on your screen or in the handouts section. And this event is also brought to you by Keeper. Keeper creates the leading password management and security software to protect businesses and consumers from data breaches. As a special offer with this Expert Series, you can attend a demo and get a free 3-year personal password manager subscription. Click on keeper.io/free here or in the handout section. So once again, take advantage of that handout section where you can find all the links that you've just seen throughout the presentation. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Dmitry Raidman. We're delighted to have Dmitry here today to talk about DevSecOps. He's one half of the great Security Architecture podcast, which, by the way, there's also a link to in your handout section. He does that podcast along with Evgeny Karam, who's done a few of these Expert Series sessions for us already this year. Dmitry is currently CTO at Cybeats, and he's been involved in the development of the standard for SBOM, or Software Bill of Materials, and is currently working on SBOM management solutions. Previous experience relevant to today is his work at SeaLights as Director of DevSecOps and his time at FLIR Systems as Senior Manager of DevSecOps and Integration. So we are in great hands for a discussion of DevSecOps 101. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dmitry.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining me here for my session about DevSecOps. I'm going to switch my screen now to sharing mode and start the presentation. Today I'm going to discuss about DevSecOps, how it ties into the application security, and the evolution of DevOps in modern organizations. We will be focusing on the security methods that can be applied on your CI/CD pipelines in order to identify and reduce the risk in the code and the application that passing through the pipeline itself. Let's go over the agenda for the session. We are going to look at DevSecOps as organizational culture. DevSecOps and application security requires the effort of both the development teams and the DevOps to recognize and work toward mutual goals of releasing secure software. After we automated the build, we automated the test execution and the deployment process, and we started measuring the code quality, the code coverage, the code complexity, and many other important metrics. It's time to start assessing our products in an easy, automated, and repeatable way as part of the same process. There are various approaches and types of tools we can apply as DevSecOps in order to get metrics about the security of the code or the product our company is developing. And no one likes to reinvent the wheel. And we all using the open source, which has a lot of positive impact on the speed and the quality of our work. However, open source sometimes can have pitfalls which we need to know before we start using it. We will look and explore the diagram we used in the Security Architecture podcast while we were recording our third season about application security, which I really recommend to watch. And finally, we will discuss about various vendors and tools that we can use for adapting or improving our DevSecOps practices. We are trying to address various issues and risks when adopting the DevSecOps culture. One of them is related to lack of secure coding practices. The issue is fundamental. There is a lack in the academy to the security topic. It definitely should be one of the base classes that engineers to be should take. The other one is that we all love and use Stack Overflow. However, the most upvoted code snippet doesn't always is the most secure one. Input validation is always very important and easy thing to achieve. There are enough examples and open source libraries, so we don't have to invent it ourselves. Just use it. Another thing is following proper code architecture and software development paradigms with clear separation of data access models, which can help us not only with making it more maintainable, but also making it more secure. A lack of secret hygiene is another common problem, especially among new developers. Freeware tools might be helping us to solve current problem quickly. However, they also might carry malicious payload, which opens access to the adversaries and allows them to make code modification on our behalf. One of the most important things we can do is to keep training our human firewall. And if you have a hunch that something is not right, better to stop and advise with your peers or DevSecOps person in your company. Let's examine what happens number of times due to lack of attention to application security and lack of DevSecOps. One of the most known breaches is SolarWinds. It happened at the end of 2020. It was a great example and one of the known software supply chain attacks that has changed our industry forever. Later on, it motivated the White House to publish the Executive Order 14028 on May 12. However, it was too late, and we became aware of another large supply chain attack that compromised Cve on July 12 this year, which only reinforced the need for DevSecOps and the importance of application security. We have seen other breaches before, when signing keys for software leaked and allowed the attackers to release software on behalf of various companies. And it all leads towards the need of obtaining control and visibility of our software supply chains. Otherwise, we'll become witnesses to a tsunami of breaches originating in various open source software AI tools, and AI models that very often going under the radar in the modern SDLC processes. We need to treat security bugs in the code as weaknesses, and we need to be able to identify them and map them to known frameworks and standards, such as OWASP Top 10 and Dmitry Top 25, and then prioritize their exploitability and fixes. On the other hand, we continuously been exposed to the risk of our software dependencies, whether they the ones that included in our code, or in many cases introduced in form of unpatched runtime dependencies in our servers. However, patching is not the answer for these problems. We need real leadership in system security engineering and secure by design vision. And to conclude, we also need to take into account that there are insider threats, both malicious and accidental, that we need to be continuously defending against by the way we structuring our processes and control gates in the DevSecOps world. Let's review some real-life examples to risks that were introduced by the lack of application security and DevSecOps. And as known philosopher George Santayana said, those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. In September 2017, Equifax announced a data breach that exposed the personal information of 147 million people, mostly in North America. The attackers leveraged exploitable vulnerability that was found 5 months prior to the breach in the famous Apache framework that called struts. This framework is used widely in enterprise Java applications and of course was also used by Equifax. The failure to patch this vulnerability in time was devastating in this case and likely to be picked up by various analysis tools that used in the modern DevSecOps or DevOps methodologies. This breach was a paramount for its time and started a tectonic shift in the industry, drawing the attention of the enterprise sectors as well as the government bodies to the topic of DevSecOps. Another great example is NPM module called Dash. This module found to be used by more than 50 other packages and also was downloaded 700,000 times from NPM repository. The developer behind the module said unusual high number of downloads can most likely to be attributed to developers making typos in the terminal while they're typing npm i dash. You can notice the space between the I and the dash. When adding new dependency to our package JSON, it's very easy to slip in the dash. And while there is nothing right now in the dash package that indicates it's malicious, developers should be careful that packages like dash don't accidentally slip into their code and their builds. On the other hand, open source software licenses that such module can carry might be a legal vulnerability on its own. Another great example is blind backdoors in deep learning models. With many companies and programmers using models and code from open source sites on the internet, this research shows how important it is to review and validate these materials before using them in your system design. Secret leaks are a great risk, and there are a few reasons why. The main thing about them is that most companies are unaware until it's too late to secret leaks. It's very complex to contain a secret leak. It's hard to remove the leak from Git history, and it requires immediate rotation and invalidation of leak secrets, which in turn can lead to outages of service and other issues. Once done, we need to perform forensics investigation if the secrets were used to access data. In many countries, there is mandatory reporting of such incidents. And I hope you never need that, but PFG Repo Cleaner can help you to remove these secrets from the history of your repositories. Credential stuffing attacks are very common, and they refer to attacks when multiple websites been attacked and associated users and passwords been used. Password spraying attacks are referring to attacks when one website been attacked and random users and passwords been used to try and get successful logins. It is crucial to keep users' passwords secure to protect against this type of cyber attacks. The first step is storing passwords on a secure database server, but it's not enough. No matter how many precautions we will take, we can never assume that the database is impenetrable. Cyber criminals can use various techniques and even collaborate with one of our coworkers. As DevSecOps, we enforce multi-factor authentication everywhere. As system designers, we use salts and hashes, such as Bcrypt, so we never keep the passwords in their original form while they're stored in the database. It helps us making it harder to match the passwords for the attackers. Using salts is imperative in prevention of password reversing techniques. Another common way is using OAuth and access refresh token architecture to eliminate as much as possible password transmissions on the wire. Some of the new approaches even aiming to solve this problem using passwordless methods and relying on SSO or identity provider for user authentication. Let's examine a different type of data leakage, where a misconfigured cloud account leaks data on 500,000 people. In this case, a leaky Amazon S3 bucket was responsible for the data breach. In order to prevent this type of occurrences at very basic level, we need always to involve the security architects of a company or the DevSecOps in the design reviews when new features been built and new capabilities added to the products. One of the fundamental things that we need to do is to restrict access to our buckets based on IP. When we sharing a direct link to the S3 objects, always use pre-signed S3 URLs that expire after a few minutes. Yes, it's a little bit more complex to implement that, but it's really boosts up the security and eliminates any options to access these objects in the other ways. And of course, when you're defining your policies and access, always follow the least privilege practices. This one is very interesting. It mixes and combines software supply chain attack together with malware that steals passwords from Google Chrome and can also take screenshot and use laptop camera, and it has been hidden since December 2020 in a widely used software repository. The way how we can protect ourselves against such type of malware and attacks is storing our passwords in password manager and of course using different passwords for different websites. When you're doing so, you're not letting your browser to access your passwords, and also when you pasting these passwords or letting the tool to do it automatically for you for the specific websites, they're not visible in any way. The other thing is very important, always enable and use multi-factor authentication such as email, Authenticator app, or any other means or approaches that are available to you. We all been in a situation when we have to develop some functionality for a feature, and then we find interesting snippet in Stack Overflow, or a mention of amazing library or module on GitHub, which we immediately include in getting our task done. Not so fast. I call this framework responsible inclusion. Before we do that, let's make sure that our decisions not going to introduce risks in the future, such as security or IP-related issues with the license of the open source we just used. First of all, let's examine it and validate truly the OSS component we are about to include and use in our project. One of the things I'm looking at is number of maintainers and their reputation on the GitHub or other open source repositories. I'm looking at frequency of contributions and open and accepted pull requests. Another thing that I'm looking at is popularity. As example, on NPM repository, how many times the specific NPM module been downloaded. I'm looking at the releases, if they are organized, if they're happening in regular frequencies. I'm looking at open issues and their severity. And I'm looking at the existence of tests and test coverage for the repository. And of course, doing all of this not removing the need to always examine what's been included in the code itself. If you follow this little framework, you always will have the confidence in open source software that you're including in your code. Let's discuss about tools available for DevSecOps and application security. The first one is SAST, and it stands for Static Application Security Testing. And the tool runs over the code written by developers and analyzes it while identifying common weaknesses and vulnerabilities. SAST shines with a good coverage of programming languages and development platforms. SAST analysis tools are simple to implement and adapt across your organization. However, they're required to allow the tool accessing your source code. Some organizations might not like this fact, especially if the tool is hosted in the cloud by its vendor, due to policies and the fact that the company IP is involved. There is very clear training benefit to developers provided by SAST, when it shows the exact location of the identified weakness in the code, and some of the tools also suggest solutions. One of the drawbacks is that most of the modern risks involve complex sequences of actions that can only be observed when the application is running. The other potential drawback is that SAST tools are usually quite slow while scanning, and the phase of the code change in the modern software development is quite high. Some of the SAST tools will allow you to run them from command line and even have them integrated as pre-commit hooks. This way you can scan the changes you introduce, and this approach is much faster. License of the SAST tools based on the number of code lines that have been analyzed. Hence, it's important to have the option in such tool to exclude in our project folders with open source component and tests. When the analysis of SAST takes a long time, we can engage it later in the process, as example after the test automation completes successfully. However, it depends on what runs longer in your organization, the test automation or the SAST analysis. The next tool we're going to discuss is SCA, which stands for Software Composition Analysis. SCA has one common thing with SAST. It's also static and done on a built or pre-built product without looking at the runtime. While SAST tools focus specifically on analyzing source files, SCA tool calculates digital signatures for the binaries and source and detects the vulnerabilities within. It does it without the need to provision access to your repositories and also without exposing the content of the source code files. It only calculates the hashes that consider to be metadata in order to identify the vulnerable components. From here we can learn that SCA is not meant to analyze the code written by our developers, and it only focuses on the dependencies included by them, and the open source code we have used both in form of code or binaries. In DevSecOps practice, it's highly recommended to have both SAST for code we write and SCA for the code and libraries we include. In some cases, the SCA will not provide exact information and generate false positives or negatives, and the reason is the fact it's still doing everything statically. As example, when the dependency is dynamically linked on the server, that in many cases determined by the operating system and its version and its patch level as well. And this is something we only can observe in the runtime. We also need to pay attention to some cases where we find significant differences in the Cve scores when comparing between different security advisories. As example, we can find 9.8 CVSS score in NVD, while Red Hat Security Advisory will provide significantly lower scores, signaling that this vulnerability not as highly exploitable on Red Hat operating system. There are some very useful free SCA tools out there, such as OWASP Dependency Track project that can be easily integrated in your CI/CD for SCA analysis. One of the new great initiatives in this space is NTIA SBOM standard that promotes the transparency of upstream OSS and COTS software we're using in development of our products in form of SBOM documents that can be generated at the build time in two formats, CycloneDX and SPDX. Using this transparency level can help us improve the quality and security of our products internally and also externally towards our downstream customers. One of the interesting tools DevSecOps can apply is DUST, which stands for Dynamic Application Security Testing. Running DUST tool requires your application to be in fully running state, preferably with a close to real dataset that copied and sanitized from your UAT or production environment. In practice, it's recommended to run the Dust against all-in-one dedicated environment that mimics the production architecture with reduced and sanitized dataset. Such environment needs to be easily recreatable using automation, and the reason for it is fuzzing that been done as part of the Dust testing. Fuzzing refers to submitting malformed inputs to an application to verify that it fails gracefully. The inputs used for fuzzing are not structured and combined from random data, special characters, shellcode, and anything else the fuzzer creators included in the logic that may find problems. These often can trigger application flaws that may corrupt the data in our systems to a level of no recovery. Now you know why it's not recommended to dust your production. The power of Dust is that it mimics the same types of external attacks that adversary would attempt, but without the need of understanding or view of an application architecture or internal source code. One of the greatest of Dust is that it can identify both known and unknown code and dependency weaknesses. However, it can do it only in the components that involved in the operation of the application that have been scanned. As example, if you have a bad job on your server that's running and not exposed as API or not communicating with the outside world, Dust wouldn't be able to identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses in such component. If we are discussing about Dust, there is an emerging trend that's called IST. IST stands for Interactive Application Security Testing, and IST analyzes code for security vulnerabilities while the app is running by an automated test, human tester, or any activity that drives the application functionality. IST approach does not require a fully functional environment compared to Dust, and it allows us to shift left in CI/CD pipeline with our security application testing. In most cases, IST is instrumented and executed in the QA environment while the test automation is running. IST involves installing agent that is responsible for the instrumentation of the code. While IST doesn't require visibility to the source code, it might be combined with other security tools, such as SAST, for better results and correlation. Similar to SAST, IST is great for developer education. It provides precise information about identified weaknesses by pinpointing the lines in the code that trigger the mechanism. As example, non-escape or sanitized inputs, while also providing remediation techniques for the weakness that was found. The next technology available for DevSecOps that I want to discuss is Rasp. Rasp is quite emerging technology in the application space, and it stands for Runtime Application Self-Protection. Similar to IST, we discussed previously, that converges Dust and SAST, Rasp capable to converge the functionality of WAF, Web Application Firewall, and IPS, Intrusion Detection and Prevention. The difference between IST and Rasp is that IST aims to identify the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the application, and Rasp aims to prevent their exploitation during runtime. In a nutshell, Rasp lets the application to run continuous security checks on itself and responds to live attacks by terminating an attacker's session and alerting defenders about the attack. Rasp can be used in two operational modes, monitoring and protection. In monitoring mode, Rasp will be alerting about the attacks, and in protection mode, Rasp will be also preventing and blocking the attacks. One of the issues of Rasp is the false security sense it might create in the development team, and then it might create negative security hygiene and a feeling of in Rasp we trust. The next technology I would like to mention is CSPM. CSPM stands for Cloud Security Posture Management and often seen as an IT tool. It's interesting that the root cause for most of the successful attacks on the cloud is related to customer misconfiguration, mismanagement, and mistakes. However, it becomes even more difficult to manage the risk, especially when the application deployed over multi-cloud environments and we automate everything. CSPM addresses a number of use cases. Identity security and compliance is a great example. It can show you how old are the API keys, what kind of access scope they grant, and if all of the users have defined MFA and when was the last time they changed their passwords. Another thing it can show you is the lack of encryption for data at rest, data storage exposed directly to the internet, when the logs are not turned on to monitor critical activities such as database access or privileged user activity, or even network flows, or misconfigured network connectivity, particularly over permissive access rules that allow anyone access resources from the internet or the other way around. If we're building complex microservices-based solutions, it's definitely important to have such capabilities in our DevSecOps toolbox. And at last, I want to mention SBOM. SBOM stands for Software Bill of Materials, and it's a standard framed by a group of industry professionals in the initiative led by NTIA in order to promote software transparency. The standard is in work since 2018, and following the recent software supply chain attacks we witnessed in the last 12 months, SBOM was endorsed in the President Biden's administration Executive Order 14028. Based on the current projection, any company in the future that builds a product which includes software will have to contractually abide providing SBOMs to its downstream customers. SBOM refers to a list of software components in machine-readable format, such as JSON or XML, and others. SBOM has the information about the relationship between the components and additional data that describes each component, such as component name, component version, supplier name, author, dependencies, timestamps, various hashes, and more. Today, there are 3 languages to describe the SBOM, regardless of the format of our choice. And these languages are CycloneDX, SPDX, and Swift, while the most popular are SPDX and CycloneDX. The best location in our pipeline to capture the SBOM is at the build stage. That's where we can capture most of the required data about the product we're building and its dependencies. Each language provider has multiple open source tools that you can use in their GitHub to automate the capturing process. However, there are tools that can be used later in the process to capture the SBOM data, as example, during your SCA process or even analyzing the build binary. Let's have a brief look at the CI/CD pipeline blueprint we prepared for our 3rd season recording the Security Architecture podcast, and identify the locations where we can employ the various DevSecOps tools. You can identify the tools that we just discussed in our presentation. You can see where they can be deployed on the pipeline of CI/CD in order to achieve the best results. If you have any questions or comments about the presentation, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow our Security Architecture podcast page. I want to thank everyone for joining me today for this session, and I wish you all secure pipelines and velocity when you're building the products for your organization. And now let's open the stage for the questions.
All right, Dmitry, yeah, you ready for some questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, so good. So I guess first off, there was a great overview of the tool sort of environment, SAST, SCA, DAST, Rasp. Are any of those sort of the most important or at least good ones to get started with?
That's a great question, and again, every technology is giving you additional layer, right? So what I would probably do as a start point, I would start with SCA because it's very that's kind of the low hanging fruit, I would say, and
Gotcha.
then I would extend it back to SAST to give some type of shift left capability. So because the earlier we identify the problems, the less it costs us to repair them, right? So that's what I would do in such case.
Great. No, that makes sense. So we had a question here from Adam, and Adam is asking, what's the best way to include data protection as part of application CI/CD pipelines?
That's a great question, and of course, it depends on the context of the question, right? So I'll try to answer it in a few ways. So one of the things is, of course, something that I wouldn't recommend to do is, example, using your real production data, which is unsanitized in any environment, which is different in production, right? So when you're deploying and you promoting a build of your application through your CI/CD pipeline, right? None of these environments would use real data. So that's kind of the basic principle that I think everyone following these days. But from data protection, I think that what is important to probably enforce and make sure is that the data encrypted always in transit and in rest, right? That's what we care about. And when it comes to data protection and rest, it's more related. Let's say it's often been handled by the underlying infrastructure layer, right? Which if we are using something like infrastructure as a code, then we definitely can assess this type of templates. Like in the case of Terraform, right? I mean, if we are and let's assume that we're using some cloud provider like AWS, so we want to make sure that all our templates are enabling encryption and rest in all of our backends, and there's no public access, and etc. etc. Or like if you're using some database services, we are always encrypting this data in rest as well. So we have like adequate cryptography methods, right? And also, when we're using we're building an application, right? Sometimes companies doing the encryption in the application itself. So the adequate method being used like AES 256 or something like. And of course, I'm not even expanding to talk about, because it's obvious to talk about TLS and SSL and certificate, right, for all of the communication of incoming and outgoing data into our system through APIs.
Okay. All right, great. This next question comes from AJ. AJ says, I'm a AWS SysOps. What's the requirement to become DevSecOps? And even I guess I'd go beyond even just requirements. Any tips for getting started as far as getting credentials or places to start learning about it.
Right. So that's a great question. I've been asked that a lot these days of how to enter the DevSecOps space, how to enter the application security space, right? And the entry point from my perspective would be to start learning about vulnerabilities, right? What is Cve, how to understand it, how to read it, right? How to read the content and the details of the vulnerability, how understanding the vectors of vulnerability, right? What it is. So it's not, so we start speaking this language, then, expand to the CPE, understanding how vulnerability related to CPE, and then try to map it into, dependencies and applications that we are developing. And that's kind of, would be natural progression. And then also looking at different type of frameworks that involving CWs, common weakness enumerators, right? Like OWASP Top 10 and others. So that would be good. A good natural step of developing in that direction.
Okay, great. Hey, so we talked a lot about tools, and then with AJ's question, we talked a little bit about how an individual could get started. And I'm just wondering, with your experience, with DevSecOps over several years now, what about sort of an organizational level? Are there ways that organizations have to reorganize sort of their IT and dev departments to get the most out of DevSecOps? Are there organizational things that people have to do?
That's actually a great question, and yeah, it's very important, right? Because same as DevOps, DevSecOps is really a culture, right? And it starts from the developer going through the operation person to the DevOps to the SysOps to the person who monitors the system eventually, and or doing pen testing or any other job there, right? So it's all cultural. And the first thing for any organization that not doing this type of activities today is really to gain visibility, right? Because you want to assess what you have, you want to understand where are your crown jewels from application security, what's important there. Then you want to understand what are the gaps, right? You want to visually see them before you can act on it, right? Before you can start creating plans of how to mitigate the risk, you need to understand the risks. So definitely, this is a way that I would recommend any organization to approach such problem. What's interesting that these days, and this is kind of, I'm a little bit biased there, right, because I'm very deeply involved in SBOM standards, but having application security and security today is really becomes something that is commodity, right? Because beforehand, you had to buy complex systems and set up the systems, learn them, dashboards, etc. But with SBOM standard, it really simplifies everything. And there's also a lot of open source tools that can help you to generate these SBOMs. But once you have these SBOMs in your hands, you really can achieve easily next steps, like understanding what kind of vulnerabilities are out there. And there are plenty open source tools that would give this visibility to you that you can find, such as dependency track by OWASP. There is also the Dagger board. There is commercial tools like the ones that my company does, but again, like, that's not the topic here. So I think that, like, it's really worth looking in that direction if you want as an entry point into this space for an organization, because this can be leveraged and used strategically across the organization to get value quick with low effort.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, great answer. And you kind of wound up with SBOM there, and that relates to a question we got from Jonah, who's asking, even with best practices, what is the continued risk of supply chain attacks?
Well, it's a similar risk, of having a ransomware attack or anything else, right? It's never enough. What we are doing is never enough, but we need to start doing at least something on this matter, right? With the supply chain risks, we need to understand their supply chain risk, right? We need to use what's so-called supply chain risk intelligence, and this is kind of a new thing that I'm seeing emerging in the markets today. So it's not anymore on building an application and my developer included an open source. That's not where it stops, right? I mean, we need to start looking beyond, and I mentioned this in the presentation, the responsible inclusion, right? We always need to think one step kind of further when we're saying, hey, like, let's see who are the maintainers of this open source we're including, right? Let's see how many issues opened and unhandled. Let's see when was the last commit to this repository or this package that we are using in our software, and let's take this also into consideration when we deciding to include something, some software component, right? Because no one likes to reinvent the wheel, right? But when we're using a wheel that already invented, we really want to make sure that we are using reliable wheel, right? So that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Maybe sort of one more question on the supply chain vulnerability side. This one also came from Jonah. In the event of compromised code, such as supply chain attack, what are some of the best practices to isolate the dependency?
So the best practice, like the most important thing when it happens, right? You want to, so let's think about the way how you become aware of it, right? So you either become aware of that by some article that you're reading, right? And like it happened with SolarWinds. The first news were out that there was an attack on the agent of SolarWinds was compromised, right? And then all the news are rolled out with all the details. What was the agent itself, right? What version of the agent was compromised, etc. So I think it was Orion agent in this case. And when you're learning about this attack, it's important to have tools in place where you can go and see, hey, do I use anywhere in software that I'm operating, right? SolarWinds. So once you get this answer, right, you at least know, okay, I need to keep tracking this incident, or I'm kind of safe, right? Or I'm out of risk. So and this type of software could be anywhere in your software that you're building and you using internally, or your software you're building and providing to your customers. So in such a case, if you are affected, you need to notify your customers. But in some cases, it's software that you're procuring from your customers, right? You may get this type of SolarWinds component there, And then again, you really want to know all this information. And again, I'm sorry to bring it back, but SBOM is kind of an answer that can give it to you, right? It's almost like, we're going to a store and we're looking at a bag of pasta and we can see what it's made of. It's made of wheat and sugar and salt and others, right? It's the same thing, right? You know that there is a component from SolarWinds. So again, you become aware that SolarWinds, let's say you know that, yes, I do use something from SolarWinds. Now when the user bringing, more details, now you know specifically what SolarWinds product you're talking about. So you need the ability to look up that specific product and say, okay, do I use this product or not? Now, once you have the details, you're also looking at the version of the product affected, right? And this could be like, something like SolarWinds, but this could be also some open source, library or open source module or package that you're using as well, right? You want to know who's behind it. You want to know exactly the detail of what package, you want to know exactly what the version of the package. And then once you have this information, you also want to have very quick, and I'm not saying if you take an example like Log4j, at the end of last year, people spent, and I spoke with many customers who dealt with thousands of hours to identify where they have Log4j, right? So you need to have very fast, quick way to determine, hey, I'm using Log4j here, I'm using SolarWinds here, which of my applications, which versions are affected. This way, once you have these capabilities, right, in hand, you can respond quickly. You can create patches, right? You can submit these patches, you can notify your customers. And also it's very important not to stop there, right? At the software level, you also want to go one level deeper into asset management, because you also want to know and have under control, where on which assets of yours this software is running, right? Because this way you can act very fast in such cases, right? They're not going to happen on a daily basis. And this is one of the problems with these things, is that it's almost like insurance thing. It happens once a year. The next Log4j5 will be maybe 2 years from now. But again, we need these capabilities so we can act fast and we can reduce our risks and mitigate them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And, I think we're probably going to need to leave it there, Dmitry, but I did want to ask you before we wrap up here, what's going on with the Security Architecture podcast? What kind of topics do you guys have coming up?
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. And Security Architecture podcast, actually we had our last season 3 was really focusing on application security. And we brought some interesting vendors that told us how they, solve the problem at various stages with different approaches. But as we always say, and that's why we also call it the security architecture, anytime you're looking for a solution or vendor, you need to make sure that, it's plays well with your current architecture, with your current tools, right? When you bring a solution, it should be able to integrate with everything that you have as part of your ecosystem. And these days, we're looking into a new topic, which is very interesting, that's called browser security, right? Or remote browser isolation. So that's our season 4 that we're focusing right now, and we're almost completed. So you're all welcome to come and see and learn.
Awesome. Yeah, and Diana had the question, where can I find the podcast? So a couple of things. On your screen there, you can see the link at the bottom. There's the microphone with the podcast icon. That's security-architecture.org. You can also find a link in your handouts to the Security Architecture podcast. Or, of course, you can Google Security Architecture podcast. Dmitry, thank you so much for being on today. Really appreciate your time and your insights, in the presentation and in the Q&A. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
All right, and before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business. It is the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the gift card today is Fernando Noriega from California. So congratulations to Fernando. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And just to answer one more question, Peter is asking, I missed most of this, will a replay be available? And yes, it will. we'll send out an email with a link. And we also have all the expert series webcasts on the Actual Tech Media YouTube channel. So check it out there. You can get the library of past events, and this one will be posted shortly. So with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Thanks to Duo, to Sneak, and to Keeper. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic weekend.